The Vanishing Passenger of the Night Express. Night trains are built for certainty. Routes are fixed. Stops are scheduled. Doors open and close with mechanical precision. Nothing enters or leaves unnoticed. That is what makes them trustworthy. On the Night Express, passengers boarded calmly, tickets verified under soft yellow lights. Faces blended into one another, ordinary, forgettable, exactly as expected. Among them was one passenger who did not stand out. No loud voice, no unusual movement, no reason to be remembered. And yet, before the train reached its next station, that passenger was gone. Not misplaced, not delayed, not hiding, simply absent. The doors had remained closed. The train never stopped. No alarm had sounded. But somewhere between departure and arrival, the Night Express had lost a passenger, and no one could explain how. Because this was not a story about escape. It was a story about disappearance inside a system that should never allow. 1. A passenger counted twice. The Night Express departed at 12:03 a.m., precisely as scheduled. The platform lights dimmed behind it, sliding backward in neat lines as the train gathered speed. Doors locked, signals cleared. The route ahead was long, uninterrupted, and familiar to everyone who worked it. Inside the carriages, passengers settled into the quiet rituals of night travel. Shoes were nudged beneath seats. Bags were adjusted. Jackets were folded with care that suggested fatigue rather than caution. Nothing felt unusual. The conductor began his first walk through the train, clipboard tucked beneath his arm, steps measured and practiced. He had worked this line long enough to recognize patterns, the difference between a crowded night, a restless one, and a calm one. This was a calm one. In the third carriage, most seats were occupied. Passengers avoided conversation, their attention turned inward, eyes half closed or fixed on passing darkness outside the windows. Conductor paused briefly at each row, scanning faces, matching seat numbers, registering presence. Seat 14A, occupied. Seat 14B, occupied. Seat 15A, occupied. Everything aligned. At row 16, he stopped. 2 passengers sat there, one by the window, one by the aisle. Between them, another seat was occupied. The conductor glanced down at his list, checked the number, then looked up again. Seat 16B, occupied. He marked it without hesitation and continued down the aisle. Behind him, the train hummed steadily, the sound constant and reassuring. The passenger in seat 16B did not look up. He sat upright, hands resting loosely in his lap, gaze directed toward the window, but not focused on anything beyond it. He wore a dark coat and carried no visible luggage beyond a slim bag tucked neatly beneath the seat. There was nothing about him that demanded attention, and yet several passengers nearby would later recall him clearly. Not his face, not his voice, but the certainty that he had been there. A woman across the aisle noticed his reflection in the window as the train passed a cluster of lights. A man behind him adjusted his knees to avoid brushing against the bag at his feet. Someone walking past briefly touched the seat back and murmured an apology. The man responded with a small nod. The train moved on, carving its way into deeper darkness. Minutes passed. The conductor completed his walk and returned to the front of the carriage. He leaned lightly against the partition, scanning the rows with an absent familiarity. The train did not stop. No announcements were made. No alarms sounded. Everything continued exactly as it should. When the conductor began his second pass, standard procedure on night routes, he expected nothing more than repetition. That was when the count changed. He reached row 16 again and slowed instinctively. 2 passengers sat there, not 3. The seat between them was empty. The conductor frowned, more annoyed than alarmed. Passengers moved all the time. People went to restrooms. Some stepped into vestibules to make phone calls when reception briefly returned. Absence, at first glance, meant nothing. He checked the seat number. 16B. Empty. He glanced back down at his list. Seat 16B, marked occupied. He looked up again. The seat remained empty. The conductor stood still for several seconds, allowing the discrepancy to resolve itself. Often the mind corrected these things automatically, memory filling in gaps, assumptions smoothing inconsistencies. But nothing corrected itself. He looked around the carriage. Passengers were calm, unbothered. Some were sleeping now. Others stared quietly into the dark. No one was standing. No one was moving through the aisle. The conductor stepped closer to the seat. There was no bag beneath it. He bent slightly, checking the floor. Nothing. He straightened slowly, a faint unease forming beneath his professional composure. He turned to the man seated by the aisle. "Excuse me," he said quietly. "Was someone sitting here earlier?" The man looked at the empty seat, then nodded. "Yes." "When did he leave?" The man hesitated. "I don't know." "Did you see him stand up?" "No." The conductor asked the woman by the window. "Yes," she said immediately. "There was someone there." "Do you remember him leaving?" She shook her head. "No, I would have noticed." The conductor stepped back into the aisle, his pulse quickening, not with panic, but with something colder. Certainty. The man had been there. That much was undeniable. He had been counted. He had been marked. He had been seen. And yet, he was gone. The conductor checked the connecting door between carriages. Its indicator light was steady, sealed since departure. He opened it briefly, glanced into the narrow passageway, then closed it again. Empty. He checked the restroom. Empty. The train was still between stations. It had not slowed. The doors had not opened. The conductor returned to seat 16B. The emptiness felt wrong in a way he could not immediately define. Not dramatic, not alarming. Incomplete. He took out his list again and reviewed it carefully. Seat 16B had been marked occupied during the first check. He remembered the moment. The man had been there. That memory was clear. What was missing was the transition. No one remembered movement. No one remembered sound. There was no moment where presence became absence. The conductor straightened and looked down the aisle. Passengers watched him now, not with fear, but with curiosity. Something in his posture had shifted, and they felt it. "Please remain seated," he said calmly. The words were automatic, reassuring. But inside, the conductor felt the first true fracture form. Not in procedure, in assumption. The train continued forward, sealed and unbroken. And in the quiet space between stations, where nothing should enter or leave unnoticed, a passenger who had been counted once, had now been counted twice, once as present, and once as inexplicably absent. Seat 16B remained empty, and the night express carried on, unaware that its certainty had already begun to unravel. The arithmetic of absence. The conductor did not announce the discrepancy immediately. Experience had taught him that numbers, when spoken aloud too quickly, could turn unease into panic. And panic had its own arithmetic, unpredictable, contagious, difficult to reverse. So he kept the count to himself and walked the length of the carriage again, slower this time, as though repetition alone might restore balance. Seat 16B remained empty. He checked the row ahead, occupied, the row behind, occupied. The surrounding pattern was intact. Only one value refused to resolve. The conductor paused near the window and watched the darkness slide past. Outside, the night offered no landmarks, just motion and distance. Inside, the carriage hummed softly, insulated from the world and obedient to its own rules. He returned to the empty seat and examined it more carefully. The cushion showed no sign of recent use. No warmth lingered. The fabric lay smooth, uncreased, as though it had been undisturbed for far longer than the few minutes since his first check. That detail troubled him. Memory insisted the man had been there. The seat insisted otherwise. The conductor crouched and ran his hand briefly along the floor beneath it. Nothing. No dropped item, no scuff out of place. The narrow gap beneath the adjacent seats was equally clean. It was as though the space had been reset. He straightened and turned to the passengers again, choosing his questions carefully. "Does anyone remember the man sitting here speaking to someone?" he asked. A few heads shook. "No. He kept to himself." "Did anyone notice him moving around before he left?" Silence. The conductor nodded, thanked them, and moved on, the unease deepening with every confirmation. The problem was no longer that the man was gone. It was that he had left no behavioral footprint behind. People left traces, even when they tried not to. They shifted, spoke, checked phones, adjusted coats. Motion was rarely invisible. Yet here, memory stopped cleanly. He took out his list again and studied the mark beside seat 16B. The ink was dark, deliberate, his own handwriting. He remembered making it, remembered the subtle drag of the pen as the train swayed. That moment was real. The absence that followed was not. At least, it did not behave like one. The conductor moved toward the intercom at the end of the carriage and pressed the button. "Control," he said quietly. "I need to report a discrepancy." The reply came quickly. "Go ahead." "A passenger confirmed present during first count is no longer on board. Train has not stopped. Doors remain sealed." There was a pause on the line, short, professional. "Any sign of forced exit?" "No." "Disturbance?" "No." "Witnesses?" "Yes." "Multiple confirmed presence. None confirmed departure." Another pause, longer this time. "Check adjoining carriages," Control said. "Rule out misplacement." "I already have," the conductor replied. "No match." "Then recheck. Quietly." The conductor ended the call and obeyed. He moved into the next carriage, then the next, scanning faces, comparing seat numbers. Each carriage followed the same pattern. Calm passengers, intact seating, no surplus bodies. No one matched the description, not even approximately. When he returned to the third carriage, something subtle had changed. People were watching him now. Not openly, not accusingly, but with the alertness people adopted when they sensed the rules were bending. The conductor stood near seat 16B and felt a peculiar sensation, like standing before a calculation that refused to balance no matter how many times it was checked. One passenger spoke softly. "Is something wrong?" "Just verifying records," the conductor replied. The answer felt insufficient even as he gave it. A woman near the aisle frowned. "He was here," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "Yes," another voice agreed. "I remember." The conductor felt a chill. Shared memory was supposed to stabilize reality. It was how errors were corrected, how illusions dissolved. But here, shared memory was reinforcing the contradiction. The conductor thought briefly of other situations: lost luggage, missed connections, ticket errors. In each case, the problem existed within the system. This problem existed outside it. He imagined the train as a closed equation. Inputs, passengers boarding. Outputs, passengers disembarking. Between stations, the equation was meant to remain constant. Yet here, something had changed without passing through either side. The conductor returned to his notebook and flipped to a fresh page. He began writing, not names, but observations. Time of boarding. First confirmation. Second count discrepancy. As he wrote, the act felt stabilizing. Documentation gave shape to uncertainty. But even as he recorded the facts, he sensed something slipping. The memory of the man's posture, the angle of his shoulders, the way he held his hands, had begun to blur. The image was losing definition even as the certainty of his presence remained intact. The conductor closed the notebook and pressed it against his thigh. He addressed the carriage again. "We'll be stopping at the next station for verification," he said. The announcement produced neither relief nor alarm. Passengers accepted it with the same quiet neutrality they had applied to everything else. The train continued forward. Seat 16B remained empty. And the conductor understood, with growing clarity, that the disappearance was not behaving like an event that had occurred. It behaved like a correction that had already been made. The system had not failed to notice the man leaving. It had adjusted to his absence as though his presence had been provisional all along. The arithmetic no longer balanced, but the train was still moving. And that, more than anything else, frightened him. Because systems that continued smoothly while their internal logic collapsed were capable of accepting almost anything. Even the idea that a passenger could be counted, confirmed, and then quietly removed from the equation without remainder, without alarm, and without the courtesy of explanation. A memory with no exit. The conductor stopped asking questions, not because he had answers, but because the answers had begun repeating themselves with unsettling precision. Every conversation circled back to the same fixed points. The man had been there. No one had seen him leave. Memory had reached a limit. He stood near the front of the third carriage, listening to the low, mechanical rhythm of the train as it carried them deeper into the night. The sound was constant, almost hypnotic. It was the sound of continuity, of systems functioning exactly as intended. And yet, continuity was precisely what had failed. Seat 16B remained empty. The conductor walked back to it slowly, as though approaching something fragile. He stopped beside the seat and looked down at it, trying to reconcile what he saw with what he knew. The space felt wrong, not because it was empty, but because it lacked context. It did not feel recently vacated. It did not feel reserved. It simply existed, unclaimed and unremarkable, as though it had never belonged to anyone at all. That thought stopped him cold. He knew someone had been there. But the seat did not behave like it remembered. Across the aisle, a woman adjusted her scarf and glanced briefly toward the empty space, her brow furrowed, not in alarm, but in mild confusion, like someone noticing an object in an unexpected place. "Strange," she murmured. The man beside her looked up. "What is?" She hesitated. "I keep thinking there was someone there. But now—" She trailed off, embarrassed by the uncertainty in her own voice. The conductor felt a tightening in his chest. This was new. Before, memory had been clear and confident. Now it was beginning to erode, not violently, not all at once, but subtly, at the edges. He addressed the woman gently. "You remember someone sitting there earlier?" She nodded. "Yes, I'm sure of it." "But?" She frowned. "But it feels less solid now, like remembering a dream." The man beside her shifted uncomfortably. "I remember him too," he said quickly, as if reassuring himself. "I remember he didn't talk." The conductor nodded and moved on, though the exchange unsettled him deeply. Memory was supposed to anchor reality. It was how events gained weight, how presence left traces behind. But here, memory was behaving like something unprotected, exposed to revision. He opened his notebook again, reading the entry beside seat 16B carefully. The name still sat there. Clear, legible, real. But when he tried to attach it to an image, nothing came. Not a face, not a voice, not even a posture. Only the certainty that the name had once referred to someone real. The conductor closed the notebook slowly. The train continued through open countryside, its speed unchanged. Outside there were no lights, no towns, no crossings, no markers of progress. Inside, the carriage felt suspended between moments, neither arriving nor departing. Time began to feel unreliable. Not slower, not faster, just flattened. Minutes passed without registering as distinct intervals. The conductor checked his watch twice in quick succession and was surprised by how little time had actually elapsed. The absence was doing something to perception. He sat down briefly in a fold-down seat near the carriage wall, needing the grounding of stillness. From there, he could see the entire row containing seat 16B in his peripheral vision. Passengers avoided looking. Directly at it now. Not deliberately, at least not consciously, but their gazes slid past the space as though it offered nothing worth seeing. The conductor realized with a sudden chill that this, too, was new. Earlier, the empty seat had drawn attention because it contradicted expectation. Now, it was beginning to feel expected. The mind, it seemed, was adjusting. A man stood up to stretch and stepped into the aisle near seat 16B. He paused briefly, looking down at the space, then frowned. "Did I drop something?" he asked aloud. "No," the woman across the aisle replied automatically. The man nodded and moved on, the moment passing without further thought. The conductor watched the exchange carefully. What troubled him was not what had been said, but what hadn't. No one had said, "Wasn't there someone sitting there?" The question no longer came naturally. The conductor stood again, his sense of urgency returning with force. he felt like the only person still holding on to. The contradiction. The only one resisting the quiet correction taking place around him. He tried to reconstruct the sequence once more, step by step. Boarding. First count. Confirmation. Second count. Absence. There should have been something between confirmation and absence. A movement, a sound, a decision. Instead, there was a blank. Not a forgotten moment, but a missing one. That distinction mattered. The conductor realized then that what unsettled him most was not the disappearance itself, but the implication it carried. If a person could vanish without leaving evidence, not physical, not behavioral, not emotional, then existence itself was more fragile than he had ever assumed. Presence depended on continuity, and continuity could fail silently. He leaned against the partition again, watching the carriage settle into its late-night stillness. Passengers were growing drowsy now. Some slept, others rested with eyes closed, their awareness turned inward. The shared memory of the missing man was thinning, not because it was false, but because it was inconvenient. The conductor felt an unexpected surge of resolve. He would remember. He would hold on to the details as long as he could, the certainty of the man's presence, the impossibility of his absence. As long as someone remembered the contradiction, it remained real. But even as he made that silent vow, he sensed how difficult it would be to keep. Memory required reinforcement, and reinforcement required attention. The train moved on, sealed and steady, its systems humming with confidence. Seat 16B remained empty, and somewhere in the quiet between stations, a memory had begun to lose its exit, no longer leading back to a person, but dissolving slowly into something far less stable. A feeling. A doubt. A question with no place left to stand. The conductor closed his eyes briefly and breathed out. The journey was still moving forward, but reality, he realized with growing unease, was no longer obligated to carry everything that boarded with it. The silence between rows. By the time the train crossed the river bridge beyond the city's edge, the third carriage had entered a new phase of quiet. It was not the tense stillness that followed sudden danger, nor the restless silence of uncertainty. This was something flatter, smoother, an absence of urgency that settled like dust. Seat 16B remained empty. The conductor stood near the connecting door, arms loosely folded, watching the passengers without appearing to do so. He had stopped pacing. Movement now felt unnecessary, even disruptive, as though too much attention might disturb a fragile equilibrium. The carriage behaved as if nothing were wrong. That was what troubled him. A woman near the aisle adjusted her bag and crossed her legs, angling her body slightly away from the empty seat. The movement was subtle, unconscious. She did not look at the seat as she did it. A man 2 rows ahead stood to retrieve something from the overhead rack. Instead of stepping into the aisle beside seat 16B, he waited until another passenger shifted, creating space on the opposite side. He reached across, collected his bag, and returned to his seat. No one commented. No one seemed aware that these small detours were happening. The conductor noticed all of them. Behavior was changing, not in reaction to the disappearance, but in accommodation of it. The space around the empty seat was being treated differently. Like an obstacle the mind had quietly agreed not to confront directly. He walked down the aisle again, slow and deliberate, and stopped beside seat 16B. The effect was immediate. Several passengers glanced up at once, then quickly looked away. The attention was brief, almost embarrassed, as though they had been caught staring at something impolite. The conductor rested a hand lightly on the seat back. The fabric was cool, neutral, indifferent. It did not feel like a seat that had been vacated. It felt like a seat that had never been claimed. The thought unsettled him enough that he withdrew his hand. He addressed the carriage calmly. "We'll be arriving at the next station shortly." No one responded. The announcement produced no visible reaction, not relief, not concern. Passengers acknowledged it the way they acknowledged weather forecasts, passively, without emotional investment. The conductor returned to his position near the front and checked his watch. Time remained correct. The schedule remained intact. Everything measurable continued to function. And yet something essential had slipped out of alignment. He looked again at seat 16B. Earlier it had felt like a gap, a hole in the pattern. Now it felt like a boundary, a place the mind no longer expected anything to occupy. Across the aisle, two passengers spoke quietly. "I don't like it," one said, her voice low enough that it barely carried. "What?" the other asked. "That I can't remember his face anymore." The conductor's attention sharpened instantly. "You remember there was someone?" the second passenger asked. "Yes," she said. "I know there was. But when I try to picture him, it's just blank." The second passenger considered this. "Maybe you didn't really look at him." "Maybe," she agreed, though her tone lacked conviction. The conversation ended there. The conductor felt something shift inside him. This was no longer about a missing person. It was about memory reorganizing itself. The mind did not like contradictions. When faced with one it could not resolve, it softened the edges. It blurred details. It reduced friction until the shape of the world felt smooth again. The conductor realized that this process had already begun. Seat 16B was no longer demanding explanation. It was being normalized. He took out his notebook again, flipping to the page with the passenger list. The name beside seat 16B still looked correct, but it no longer felt anchored to anything tangible. It had become a reference without a referent, a label without an object. He closed the notebook and pressed it flat against his thigh, grounding himself in the physical weight of it. The train continued through uninterrupted darkness. Minutes passed, then more. The conductor could no longer tell how long it had been since the disappearance was discovered. Time seemed to fold inward, moments stacking without clear separation. Passengers grew drowsier. Some slept. Others rested with eyes closed, their awareness drifting in and out. No one spoke about the missing man anymore. That silence felt heavier than any question had. The conductor walked back to seat 16B once more, compelled by a need he could not articulate. He stood there and spoke quietly, not to the passengers, but to the space itself. "You were occupied." The words sounded strange in the open air. The seat did not respond, of course. Nothing changed. He straightened slowly. For the first time since the disappearance, he felt something close to fear, not of what had happened, but of what was happening now. The event was no longer unfolding. It was being absorbed. Reality was adjusting its posture, redistributing weight, rebalancing itself around the absence. The longer the train moved forward without resolution, the less necessary that resolution became. The conductor imagined the end of the journey, passengers disembarking, doors opening, reports filed or not filed. He imagined the empty seat being cleaned, prepared for the next run, its emptiness unquestioned. He imagined the name beside seat 16B fading from relevance, then from memory. The thought left him cold, because if the disappearance could be absorbed so completely, then it was not an exception, it was a function. The train did not need to understand what it carried. It only needed to continue carrying what remained. Seat 16B remained empty, and the silence around it grew thicker, not oppressive, not dramatic, but complete. The conductor took a slow breath and looked down the aisle one last time. Passengers were calm. The carriage was orderly. The journey was intact. Only one thing was missing. And already the world was learning how to proceed as though it never mattered at all. The stop that settled nothing. The announcement arrived with mechanical neutrality. "We will be arriving at the next station shortly." The conductor's voice echoed softly through the carriage, practiced and even. It was the sound of order asserting itself, of structure returning after too long suspended in uncertainty. Passengers stirred. Some opened their eyes. Others adjusted coats or reached for bags. Arrival had weight. It divided experience into before and after. And for the conductor, this station represented something dangerously close to relief. Stations brought witnesses, authority, procedure. They brought the outside world into sealed spaces. Seat 16B remained empty. The train slowed, its motion easing into stillness beneath bright white platform lights. The sudden clarity of illumination felt almost intrusive after the long stretch of darkness. The carriage looked smaller now, more defined, its contents exposed. The doors opened. Cool air entered, carrying with it the sounds of footsteps, distant announcements, and another train departing on a parallel track. Life functioning normally. Two station officials boarded with calm efficiency, clipboards in hand. They moved with the confidence of people who expected problems to have solutions. The conductor explained quietly, "A passenger confirmed during the first count is no longer present. No stop between stations, no door access." The officials listened without interruption. One nodded. "Which seat?" 16B. They approached the row together. The official nearest the seat paused, looked down at it, then glanced around the carriage. His expression showed mild interest, but no alarm. "This seat is empty," he said. "Yes," the conductor replied. "It wasn't earlier." The official crouched slightly, checking beneath the seat, then stood again. "Any belongings left behind?" "No." "Any witnesses?" "Yes, multiple. All confirmed presence, none confirmed departure." The official made a note, then straightened. "Has anyone reported a disturbance?" "No." "Unauthorized exit?" "No." The second official flipped through her list. "From our records," she said, "everyone currently on board is accounted for." The words landed heavily. The conductor frowned. "But someone is missing." The official considered him for a moment. "From where?" The question stunned him. "From the train," he said carefully. The official shook his head gently. "There's no one missing from this train. Everyone present has a ticket and a seat." "But," the conductor began. The official raised a hand, not dismissively, but conclusively. "An empty seat isn't an incident, unless there's evidence of harm or a violation of protocol. There's nothing to act on." The conductor felt something collapse inward, not sharply, but completely. The officials finished their inspection, thanked the passengers for their patience, and stepped back onto the platform. The doors closed behind them with a soft, final sound. The whistle blew. The train moved on. As the station slid away, the conductor realized what had just happened. The absence had been examined and accepted. The carriage felt different now, not because something had changed, but because something would not. Passengers exchanged brief glances, then returned to their own concerns. No one spoke about the missing man. The station's refusal to engage had set the tone more decisively than any explanation could have. Authority had looked directly at the problem and declined to name it one. Seat 16B remained empty, but it no longer felt like a problem waiting to be solved. It felt validated. A woman near the aisle exhaled quietly, shoulders relaxing. A man leaned back and closed his eyes. The tension that had once sharpened awareness dissolved into something softer and heavier: resignation. The conductor returned to the front of the carriage, his posture unchanged, his expression composed. Inside, something had settled into place with uncomfortable permanence. The system had spoken. And the system did not recognize loss unless it disrupted function. The train continued through the night, its rhythm steady, its purpose intact. Outside, the darkness returned, uninterrupted and indifferent. The conductor looked down the aisle again. Passengers were calm, seats were filled, order was restored. Except for one small, precise detail. Seat 16B remained empty, and now no one expected it to be otherwise. The conductor felt the last of his urgency drain away, not because he had accepted what happened, but because there was no longer anywhere for urgency to go. There would be no report to file, no escalation to pursue. The disappearance had passed through the only corrective mechanism available to it, and emerged unchanged. He thought briefly of the man, of the certainty that had once anchored his presence. That certainty now felt distant, oddly fragile, like a memory recalled too many times. The conductor understood, then, that the journey had crossed an irreversible threshold. Before the station, the absence had been a contradiction. After the station, it had become a condition. The train did not need to understand it. It only needed to continue. Seat 16B remained empty as the night express carried on, its wheels tracing familiar lines through darkness. And somewhere between departure and arrival, the world had quietly decided that nothing was wrong. When the system adjusted. After the station fell away behind them, the night express did not feel lighter. It felt resolved. The train gathered speed smoothly, its motion steady and confident, as though the brief interruption had never occurred. Outside, the platform lights thinned into lines and vanished, replaced once more by uninterrupted darkness. Inside, the carriage settled into a quieter rhythm, one that no longer carried expectation. Seat 16B remained empty. The conductor stood near the front of the carriage longer than necessary, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He had expected to feel something after the station: relief, frustration, even anger. Instead, he felt something far more unsettling: normalcy. Passengers resumed their routines with an ease that bordered on indifference. Bags were shifted, sleeves rolled up. A few people closed their eyes and leaned into the gentle sway of the train. Conversations, where they existed at all, returned to mundane subjects. No one mentioned the missing man. The conductor walked down the aisle again, this time without urgency. He noticed that his steps had slowed, not because he was cautious, but because there was no longer anything he felt compelled to confirm. He stopped beside seat 16B. Earlier, this space had pulled at his attention like a loose thread. Now, it did not resist his gaze. It sat there quietly, fully integrated into the pattern of the carriage. The absence no longer disrupted the design. A man stood to stretch his legs and paused near the empty seat. For a brief moment, the conductor watched him closely, half expecting hesitation or recognition. The man glanced down, frowned faintly, as if puzzled by his own pause, then continued walking. He did not sit. Later, when asked why, he would not have an answer. "It didn't feel like an option," he would say. The conductor felt a subtle tightening in his chest. Choice implied awareness. This was something else. He moved on and resumed his ticket checks in the adjoining rows. Everything aligned, every passenger matched their seat, every number corresponded. The system functioned perfectly, with one exception it no longer seemed to acknowledge. When the conductor reached the end of the carriage, he realized he had not looked at his notebook once during the entire check. The realization startled him. Earlier, the notebook had been an anchor, proof that the man had existed, that the contradiction was real. Now, the urge to consult it had faded. The system no longer needed documentation. It had adapted. The conductor sat briefly in the fold-down seat near the partition, watching the carriage from a distance. From this angle, seat 16B was less prominent, its emptiness no longer framed by attention. Passengers' gazes slid past it naturally. Their bodies adjusted around it. They were not avoiding the seat consciously. They were forgetting it. A woman across the aisle spoke quietly to her companion. "I always feel calmer after stops," she said, "like things reset." Her companion nodded. "Yeah, like everything's back where it should be." The conductor closed his eyes for a moment. Back where it should be. The phrase echoed unpleasantly, because by every rule he understood, something was not where it should be, and yet the carriage behaved as though it were. The conductor took out his notebook again, almost reluctantly. He opened it to the page with the passenger list and stared at the entry for seat 16B. The name was still there. But it felt wrong now. Not because it represented loss, but because it represented inconsistency. It was the only thing refusing to adapt. The conductor considered briefly what would happen if he crossed the name out. The thought felt disturbingly natural, like straightening a crooked line. The idea frightened him enough that he closed the notebook quickly and slid it back into his pocket. Across the carriage, a passenger asked quietly, "Are we on time?" "Yes," the conductor replied automatically. And it was true. The train was exactly on schedule. The disappearance had not delayed anything. That fact carried its own quiet menace. If the loss of a person did not slow the system, even for a moment, then the system had no incentive to resist it. The conductor looked down the aisle again. Passengers rested. Lights glowed steadily. The train moved forward without effort. Seat 16B remained empty. But now, its emptiness felt permanent. Not because anyone had decided it should be, but because the journey had learned how to continue without questioning it. The conductor felt the final shape of the problem take form in his mind. The system had not failed. It had succeeded. It had absorbed an anomaly without disrupting function, and in doing so, it had demonstrated something profoundly unsettling. That presence was conditional. That existence within a system was only guaranteed as long as it aligned with continuity. The conductor leaned back and exhaled slowly. He was no longer waiting for the man to reappear. That expectation had dissolved somewhere after the station. Now, he was waiting for something else. For the moment when even he would stop expecting the contradiction to matter. The train pressed onward through the night, its motion smooth and assured. Seat 16B remained empty. And with every passing mile, the system grew more confident in its adjustment, carrying forward what remained and leaving behind what no longer fit, without ceremony, without alarm, and without ever acknowledging that anything had been lost at all. The day the question stopped being asked. The most unsettling change did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, disguised as relief. Sometime after the station, after the officials had boarded, examined, and departed, the carriage slipped into a rhythm that felt almost peaceful. The kind of calm that came not from resolution, but from surrender. Passengers adjusted their positions, leaned back, closed their eyes. The tension that had once sharpened every movement softened into something heavier and more inert. Seat 16B remained empty. The conductor noticed that he no longer checked it automatically when he walked past. The realization came as a shock. Earlier, his eyes had been drawn to the space every time, counting, verifying, resisting the idea that the absence could simply exist without consequence. Now, his gaze passed over the row without catching, sliding forward to the next set of numbers as though nothing were missing at all. He stopped mid-aisle, disturbed by his own behavior. The seat was still empty. The fact had not changed. What had changed was him. The urgency that once accompanied the sight of the empty space had dulled. Not vanished entirely, but weakened, like a warning sound fading into background noise. The conductor stood still for a moment, forcing himself to look directly at the seat, to remember why it mattered. The effort felt strangely deliberate. That, too, frightened him. Across the aisle, a woman stirred and opened her eyes. She looked around the carriage, then frowned faintly, as if something were out of place. "Do you ever feel like you've forgotten something important?" she asked the man beside her. He considered the question, then shrugged. "All the time." She smiled weakly and closed her eyes again. The conductor felt a chill run through him. This was how it happened, not through denial or argument, but through fatigue. The mind grew tired of holding contradictions and quietly set them down. He continued walking, his steps slow, his posture relaxed in a way that felt undeserved. The carriage no longer watched him with expectation. Passengers had stopped tracking his movements, stopped waiting for explanations he could not give. They had accepted that there would be none. Seat 16B had ceased to be a problem. It had become scenery. A man stood up to stretch and stepped into the aisle near the empty seat. The conductor watched closely, half expecting hesitation or recognition, some flicker of awareness that this space carried significance. The man glanced down briefly, then looked away. Again, attention already moving on. No reaction. No question. The conductor felt something inside him give way. Not dramatically, not all at once, but decisively. This was the moment no one guarded against. Not the disappearance, not the discovery, not the inspection. This, the moment when attention withdrew. He returned to the front of the carriage and leaned lightly against the partition. The train continued through the darkness with unwavering confidence. Outside, the landscape offered nothing to fix the eye. No towns, no crossings, no signals. Inside, the carriage had become complete again. Complete despite the contradiction. He took out his notebook and opened it to the passenger list. The name beside seat 16B still stared back at him, unchanged by time or acceptance. He traced it with his eyes, grounding himself in the physical reality of ink and paper. For now, the name still meant something to him, but he could feel the effort required to maintain that meaning. Memory was not passive. It demanded reinforcement, and reinforcement demanded attention, attention that the rest of the carriage had already withdrawn. The conductor wondered how long he could remain the only one holding the contradiction. He imagined the end of the journey, the final station, the doors opening, passengers stepping off. He imagined filing reports, or choosing not to. He imagined telling the story weeks later, only to find that it sounded implausible even to himself. A passenger had vanished. No one saw him leave. The story already felt thin, unsupported by the world around it. He closed the notebook slowly. Across the carriage, passengers slept or rested, their breathing slow and even. The rhythm of the train matched their stillness, reinforcing the illusion that everything was exactly as it should be. Seat 16B remained empty. But now, it no longer felt like an interruption. It felt expected. The conductor realized with a quiet dread that expectation was the final barrier. As long as someone expected the seat to be occupied, the absence remained unstable. But once expectation adjusted, the absence became fixed. Reality, it seemed, did not require truth. It required coherence. And coherence had been restored. He stood there, listening to the train carry them forward, and understood that the disappearance had reached its most complete form, not when the man vanished, but when the world stopped making room for his return. Soon, even the conductor would stop checking the seat. Soon, the name in the notebook would feel like a mistake rather than a record. Soon, the idea that someone had ever been there would feel unnecessary. The train moved on, steady and assured. Seat 16B remained empty. And somewhere between 1 mile and the next, the question that had once demanded an answer finally stopped being asked. Not because it had been answered, but because nothing in the journey required it anymore. When the doors opened again, words, rule compliant, the announcement came without emphasis. "We will be arriving at the next station shortly." The conductor's voice sounded ordinary, too ordinary considering what had preceded it. The words moved through the carriage and settled without resistance. Passengers stirred, straightening in their seats, returning to the rituals of arrival with quiet efficiency. Seat 16B remained empty. The train slowed, its motion easing into a controlled glide. Outside, lights appeared, first scattered, then ordered. Platforms emerged from the darkness, lines and signage snapping into clarity beneath white overhead lamps. The world returned in sharp focus. The train came to a stop, the doors opened. Cool air flowed into the carriage, carrying the layered sounds of the station, footsteps, distant voices, a departure announcement echoing from another platform. It was the sound of systems overlapping, of movement being redistributed rather than interrupted. Passengers stood. Bags were lifted down. Coats were shrugged on. The aisle filled with visible motion. This was the moment the conductor had been waiting for. Disembarkation did not allow subtlety. People rose, turned, stepped into aisles. Bodies crossed paths. Space changed shape in obvious, undeniable ways. If the missing passenger had merely gone unnoticed, if he had been overlooked rather than erased, this was where the error would reveal itself. Passengers filed out in an orderly line. One by one they passed seat 16B. No one paused. No one glanced at the space with recognition or confusion. The conductor stood near the door, watching closely. Faces passed him, awake, tired, focused on destinations beyond the train. Each person stepped off with purpose, carrying their presence fully into the world beyond the carriage. Seat 16B was passed again and again. No reaction. When the last passenger disembarked, the carriage was empty, except for the conductor. The silence that followed was different from the silence of night. It was clean, uncomplicated, stripped of expectation. Without passengers, the carriage felt smaller, more precise, more contained. The conductor walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps echoing softly. He stopped beside seat 16B and looked at it under the station's bright lights. The fabric was unmarked. The floor beneath was clean. The space held no residue of occupation. He placed his hand on the seat back. It was cool, neutral. The absence did not feel recent. It felt settled. The conductor stepped off the train briefly and stood on the platform, turning to look back inside through the open doors. From this angle, the empty seat was barely distinguishable. It blended seamlessly into the geometry of the carriage, no longer a gap, just part of the pattern between journeys. He understood then that arrival had not threatened the disappearance, it had confirmed it. The doors closed, the whistle sounded, the train prepared to depart again. The conductor returned to his place and sat down, feeling the subtle shift as the train began to move. The carriage, empty now, absorbed the motion without resistance. Outside, the station slid away. The world had looked inside the train, and it had found nothing missing. As the night express gathered speed once more, the conductor felt the last threads of anticipation loosen. There was no longer anything to wait for, no revelation delayed by movement, no answer hidden by darkness. Whatever had happened was complete. Seat 16B remained empty. Not temporarily, not suspiciously. Simply so. The conductor closed his eyes briefly and tried, one final time, to recall the man's face. He could not. The memory had thinned, losing detail even as it retained certainty. He knew the man had boarded. He knew he had been counted. But the image was gone. The past was adjusting. The train moved on through the night, toward its next segment of route, carrying nothing but empty seats and mechanical. Purpose. Seat 16B waited. Not expectantly, not ominously. Just there. And the conductor realized, with a clarity that offered no comfort, that the disappearance had passed its final test. The doors had opened, the world had checked, and reality, satisfied, had allowed the train to continue as though nothing had ever been wrong at all. The record that wouldn't close. Morning crept in quietly. It did not arrive with a clear boundary, only a gradual thinning of darkness. The windows lightened from black to gray, then to a pale, uncertain blue. Fields emerged, soft and indistinct, as though the world itself was still deciding what it was willing to reveal. The night express continued on schedule. New passengers boarded at the next stop, moving with the calm efficiency of people who assumed that systems worked because they always had. Tickets were scanned, seats were chosen. Conversations resumed at a volume appropriate for early hours. Seat 16B remained empty. No one hesitated beside it. No one asked if it was taken. The conductor watched this carefully, feeling the final stage of the process settle into place. This was no longer a night anomaly, no longer a problem contained by darkness. Daylight had entered the carriage, and with it the opportunity for correction. Nothing corrected itself. He walked down the aisle and checked tickets again, performing the routine with hands that moved automatically. Numbers matched, names aligned, faces corresponded. When he reached row 16, his pen hovered for the briefest moment. Seat 16B, unoccupied. He marked it. The motion startled him. He had not meant to do it so easily. The conductor stood still for a second, aware that something fundamental had just shifted. Earlier, every interaction with the empty seat had carried resistance, mental, emotional, procedural. Now, the record had adjusted without protest. The system had learned the new total. He moved on, heart heavy with a realization he could not fully articulate. This was not forgetfulness. It was adaptation. Later, during a quieter stretch of track, the conductor returned to the staff compartment and sat down heavily. He removed his notebook and opened it to the page he had avoided since the station. Seat 16B. The name was still there, written clearly in his own hand. The ink had not faded. The letters had not blurred. And yet, the name felt wrong. Not incorrect, unnecessary. It no longer fit the rest of the record. Everything else balanced neatly. Boarding matched disembarkation. Counts resolved themselves cleanly. Only this one entry resisted closure. The conductor stared at it for a long time. Accounts were meant to close. That was their purpose. What came in went out. What boarded arrived somewhere. But this account did not close. It hovered, an excess detail in a system that had already moved on. Across the carriage, passengers spoke quietly. "Do you know what stop we're at?" one asked. "Almost there," another replied. Ordinary questions, ordinary answers, life proceeding without interruption. The conductor closed the notebook slowly and rested it on his knee. He realized with a dull ache that no one else on the train was still carrying the contradiction, not consciously. Passengers glanced past seat 16B without noticing it. Their bodies adjusted naturally around the space. Their memories had already rewritten the journey to exclude the missing passenger. Soon, they would remember boarding a train with one fewer occupied seat. Soon, the idea that someone had vanished would feel implausible, even absurd. The conductor tried again to recall the man in detail. He remembered the act of counting him, the certainty of confirmation. But the image itself was gone. Memory had retained the fact, but released the person. The train slowed for another station. More passengers disembarked. Others boarded. The carriage breathed in and out, full and functional. Seat 16B remained untouched. Conductor felt a quiet despair, not dramatic, not sharp, but persistent. This was how reality protected itself, not by preserving truth, but by preserving coherence. Contradictions were not fought, they were softened, then absorbed, then quietly forgotten. The conductor looked down the aisle once more. Everything was working. That was the worst part. He understood then that nothing more would happen. There would be no sudden realization, no delayed explanation, no report that changed anything. The disappearance had completed its arc. What remained was paperwork, and even that was losing relevance. The conductor placed the notebook back into his pocket, feeling the weight of it diminish. Soon, even he would stop opening it. The effort required to remember would outweigh the comfort of forgetting. Seat 16B remained empty as the train moved steadily toward its final destination, and in the growing light of morning, the conductor accepted something he had resisted all night. The passenger had not been lost. He had been balanced out, removed not by force, not by accident, but by a system that valued continuity more than completeness. The record would never close, but no one would keep checking it. And once that happened, the absence would no longer be a mystery. It would simply be the way the journey had always been. The journey without a remainder. The final station approached with the certainty only daylight could provide. Sunlight filled the windows completely now, washing the carriage in clear, unambiguous color. The shadows of night, so accommodating to uncertainty, had retreated. Everything was visible. Everything was accounted for. Or so it appeared. The night express slowed smoothly and came to rest beneath the broad canopy of the terminal. The platform outside was busy with morning movement. People walking with purpose, voices overlapping, the sound of rolling luggage echoing faintly. The conductor stood at the front of the carriage, watching the last act of the journey unfold. Passengers rose, bags were retrieved, coats were adjusted. Phones were checked for messages waiting at the end of the line. They moved down the aisle in orderly lines, stepping into the world beyond the train with the quiet relief of people who believed the journey was complete. Seat 16B remained empty. No one paused beside it. No one glanced at it with recognition. No one hesitated as they passed. The conductor felt the finality of that pass more strongly than any previous moment. This was the last opportunity for disruption, the final chance for the absence to assert itself as a problem. It did not. The carriage emptied. When the last passenger stepped onto the platform, the conductor waited a moment before following. He stood alone now in the third carriage, the silence total and unbroken. Without people, The space looked exactly as it should. Seats aligned, lights steady, floor clear. Seat 16B did not stand out. In the full clarity of morning, it was impossible to imagine why this seat had ever mattered. The conductor walked slowly down the aisle one final time, his footsteps echoing softly. He stopped beside seat 16B and rested his hand briefly on the seat back. There was no sensation, no residual warmth, no impression. Nothing that suggested a presence had ever occupied the space. He withdrew his hand and exhaled quietly. The notebook rested heavy in his pocket, though its weight now felt symbolic rather than functional. He took it out and opened it for the last time. The entry for seat 16B remained. Assigned, counted, confirmed. The ink was unchanged, but its authority was gone. The conductor considered striking the entry through, drawing a single line that would restore balance to the page. The idea came naturally, almost automatically. Then he stopped. He understood, with sudden clarity, that crossing it out would not correct the record. It would complete the disappearance. As long as the entry remained, some trace of contradiction endured. Quiet, unacknowledged, but real. Not enough to disrupt the system, but enough to suggest that something had once passed through it without being carried forward. He closed the notebook and returned it to his pocket. Outside, announcements echoed through the terminal. Another train arrived, another departed. Schedules held. The conductor turned off the carriage lights one by one, the interior dimming gently. He walked to the door and stepped onto the platform, pulling it closed behind him. The night express stood ready for its next run. Clean, orderly, whole. No report would be filed. There would be nothing to escalate, nothing to explain. By every measurable standard, the journey had been successful. The conductor paused and looked back at the train through the glass. The man had boarded. That fact had once been undeniable. The man had vanished. That fact had once demanded explanation. Now, both truths existed without friction, one fading quietly, the other already absorbed. The train did not need to resolve the contradiction. It only needed to continue. As the conductor turned away, he understood the final shape of what had happened. The night express had not lost a passenger. It had continued without remainder. The system had adjusted its totals, smoothing away excess until nothing disrupted its forward motion. The absence did not need to be justified. It did not need to be mourned. It simply needed to be accepted. The train departed again on schedule, carrying new passengers who would never know that someone had once occupied a seat that now felt entirely ordinary. Seat 16B remained empty, not as evidence, not as warning, but as proof of something quietly profound. That existence, within a perfectly functioning system, was conditional, and once continuity no longer required you, the journey would proceed as though you had never been there at all. Some mysteries end with answers. This one ends with balance. A man boarded the train. He was counted. He was confirmed. And then the journey adjusted. No alarms sounded. No rules were broken. The train arrived exactly on time. Perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all, not that a passenger vanished, but that the world did not need him to continue. that systems prefer continuity over completeness, that absence, once accepted, becomes invisible. So the next time you travel, late at night or early in the morning, pay attention, not just to who is with you, but to who should be there. Because sometimes nothing is lost. Sometimes the count is simply corrected.